The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls like a hungry wolf. Martha Caldwell pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the dying embers in her fireplace. Outside, the Arizona Territory was buried under the worst winter storm anyone could remember. Inside her small cabin, things were just as cold and desperate. 6 months ago, her husband Thomas had died coughing up blood. The doctor called it consumption, but Martha knew it was really the hard life of trying to make a living on this unforgiving land that had killed him. Thomas had been a good man, always believing that their little homestead would somehow make them rich. He'd been wrong about that, just like he'd been wrong about a lot of things. Now Martha was alone with nothing but problems. The roof leaked so bad that she had to put 3 buckets out every time it rained or snowed. The barn had collapsed under the weight of the snow last week, crushing what was left of their crops. Their 2 cows had frozen to death, and the chickens had long since become dinner. Even worse, men in fancy suits kept showing up at her door with papers, demanding money that Thomas had borrowed and never paid back. Martha walked to her kitchen and opened the last jar of preserved peaches. She'd been saving it for Christmas, but Christmas was still 2 weeks away, and she was so hungry her stomach felt like it was eating itself. She took just 1 small spoonful, trying to make it last. The sweet taste reminded her of better times when Thomas was alive and they still had hope. As she was putting the jar back, she heard a strange sound outside. It wasn't the wind this time. It sounded like someone groaning in pain. Martha grabbed the old rifle that Thomas had taught her to use and slowly opened the door. The cold air hit her like a slap, and the snow was falling so thick she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. She followed the sound toward the old stone well behind her cabin. There, collapsed in the snow, was a man. But this wasn't just any man. Even half buried in snow and clearly hurt bad, she could tell he was Apache. His long black hair was matted with blood, and his clothes were torn and stained red in several places. 3 bullet holes marked his escape from somewhere, and his breathing was shallow and quick. Martha's first thought was to run back inside and lock the door. Everyone knew the Apache were dangerous. The newspapers were full of stories about raids and attacks. The cavalry was always chasing them, and most white folks shoot first and ask questions later when they saw one. But as she stood there pointing her rifle at him, something made her stop. Maybe it was the way he looked at her without any hate in his eyes, even though he had every reason to hate white people. Maybe it was because she knew what it felt like to be desperate and alone. Or maybe it was just because she was a woman who had spent her whole life taking care of hurt things, from sick chickens to her dying husband. The man tried to say something, but the words came out weak and mixed with blood. His dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there that surprised her. Gratitude. He wasn't asking her to help him, but somehow she knew he was grateful that another human being had found him, even if that person might be his enemy. Martha looked around at the empty landscape. There was no one else for miles. No cavalry, no other settlers, nobody who would know what she decided to do next. The snow was getting heavier, and if she left him out here, he would be dead by morning. If she helped him and someone found out, she could be in serious trouble. People had been hanged for less than helping Apache fugitives, but Martha Caldwell had already lost everything that mattered to her. Her husband, her livestock, her crops, and soon probably her home. What did she have left to lose? Her life? Some days that didn't seem like much of a loss either. She put down the rifle and grabbed the man under his arms. He was heavier than she expected, and dragging him through the snow to her cabin was the hardest thing she'd done since burying Thomas. But somehow she managed it, leaving a trail of blood in the white snow behind them. Inside her cabin, she cleared off the old wooden table and managed to lift him onto it. In the light from her oil lamp, she could see his wounds more clearly. 2 bullet holes in his shoulder and 1 in his leg. He'd lost a lot of blood, but none of the shots had hit anything that would kill him right away. If she could stop the bleeding and keep infection away, he might live. Martha had learned about treating wounds from taking care of Thomas and the animals. She heated water on her stove and tore up one of her few remaining clean sheets. As she worked to clean his wounds, the Apache man drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would mumble words in his own language, and once he grabbed her wrist when she was cleaning a particularly bad cut. But his grip was gentle, not threatening. By the time she had bandaged all his wounds, Martha was exhausted. She looked at this stranger lying on her table and wondered what she had gotten herself into. Tomorrow he might try to kill her. Tomorrow the cavalry might show up looking for him. Tomorrow her creditors might come back and find her harboring a fugitive, but tonight, she had done something that felt right for the first time since Thomas died. She made a bed for him on the floor near the fireplace and covered him with her own blanket. Then she sat in her chair and watched him sleep, her rifle across her lap just in case. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside her cabin something had changed. For the first time in months, Martha didn't feel completely alone. As the night wore on, she found herself wondering about this man. Who was he? What had he done to make the cavalry chase him? Did he have a family somewhere wondering if he was alive? She'd heard stories about Apache warriors, but she'd never actually met one before. He didn't look like the savage monster the newspapers described. He looked like a man who was hurt and far from home. The snow kept falling and Martha kept watching. She didn't know it yet, but she had just made a decision that would change her life forever. In saving the life of this Apache warrior, she had started a story that people would tell for generations. But right now all she knew was that there was another human being in her cabin, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was facing the world completely alone. When Martha woke up the next morning, she had almost convinced herself that the whole thing had been a dream. But then she saw him lying by her fireplace, still breathing but barely moving. The Apache warrior looked even worse in the daylight. His face was pale under his dark skin, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold cabin. She quietly got up and checked his bandages. Blood had soaked through some of them during the night. Without making a sound, she heated more water and carefully changed the dressings. He stirred once when she touched a tender spot, and his eyes opened for just a moment. When he saw her face, something that might have been relief crossed his features before he drifted back to sleep. For the next 3 days, Martha hardly left his side. She fed him water and thin soup made from her last few vegetables, spooning it into his mouth when he was too weak to drink on his own. She cleaned his wounds twice a day and fought the fever that tried to take him. During the worst of it, he talked in his sleep, speaking rapid words in Apache that she couldn't understand but that sounded urgent and important. On the 4th morning, his eyes opened and stayed open. He looked around the cabin, taking in his surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had learned to notice everything. When his gaze settled on Martha, sitting in her chair with dark circles under her eyes from watching over him, he tried to sit up. "No," Martha said quickly, pressing him gently back down. "You need to rest. You're still too weak." He stared at her for a long moment, clearly surprised to be alive and more surprised to be in the care of a white woman. Then he spoke his first word to her. "Water." His voice was rough from fever and pain, but Martha understood. She brought him a cup and helped him drink. He drained it completely and looked at her with something that might have been wonder. "Thank you," he said in careful English. Over the next few days, they began to communicate in a strange mix of his limited English, her even more limited Spanish, and a lot of pointing and hand gestures. She learned that his name was something that sounded like Nail Nish when he said it. When she tried to repeat it, he smiled for the first time, and she realized what a difference that smile made to his whole face. He learned that her name was Martha, and that she lived alone since her husband died. When she used gestures to show Thomas coughing and then lying still, Nalnish nodded with understanding. Death was something both their peoples knew well. As he got stronger, Nalnish began to observe everything about Martha's life with the sharp eyes of someone who had learned to read signs and track prey. He noticed how she rationed every bit of food, eating just a few spoonfuls of soup while giving him a full bowl. He saw the buckets catching drips from the leaking roof and the way she shivered even when she was sitting close to the fire. He watched her count and recount her few remaining coins and saw the worry lines that creased her face when she thought he wasn't looking. One morning, Martha found him sitting up and drawing in the dirt floor with his finger. The pictures showed mountains and horses, people gathered around fires, and children playing. When she knelt down to look closer, he began to tell her about his life using the pictures as guides. He drew a man with feathers in his hair and pointed to himself, then made gestures that showed respect and authority. Martha understood that he was someone important among his people, maybe a chief or the son of a chief. He drew pictures of battles with soldiers, and she saw the sadness in his eyes as he showed how his people had been forced from their homes. Martha found herself drawn into these silent conversations. She began to show him things too, pointing to a tintype photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. and to the simple wooden cross that Thomas had carved for their mantelpiece. Nalnish studied these items with respect, understanding that they were sacred to her just as his own traditions were sacred to him. As the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Despite the language barrier and the vast differences in their worlds, Martha and Nalnish began to understand each other in ways that went beyond words. When she was struggling to reach something on a high shelf, he would quietly get up and help her even though his wounds were still healing. When he had nightmares about whatever he had been running from, she would sit beside him and speak softly until he calmed down. He began teaching her things without even meaning to. When she was trying to start a fire with damp wood and failing, he showed her a different way to arrange the kindling that worked much better. When she was wondering what wild plants might be safe to eat, he drew pictures in the dirt of ones that could help when food was scarce. Martha found herself looking forward to these quiet lessons. For months after Thomas died, she had felt like she was just surviving, getting through each day without any purpose beyond not giving up. But now she had someone to take care of, someone who needed her. And strangely, someone who seemed to understand her loneliness even though he came from a completely different world. One afternoon, Martha was trying to mend a tear in her only good dress when she noticed Nalnish watching her with a puzzled expression. She held up the needle and thread, showing him what she was doing, but he continued to look confused. Finally, he got up and came over to examine her sewing more closely. To Martha's surprise, he took the dress from her hands and began to repair the tear, using a completely different technique. Instead of the simple running stitch she had been using, he wove the thread back and forth in a pattern that was not only stronger but almost invisible when he finished. "How did you learn to do that?" Martha asked, amazed at the neat repair. Nalnish pointed to himself and made a gesture that seemed to mean all people, then mimicked sewing motions. Martha realized that among his people, men probably learned to repair their own clothes and equipment, just like they learned to hunt and fight. It was practical knowledge that everyone needed to survive. Over the following days, Martha discovered that Nalnish had skills she had never imagined. He could predict weather changes by watching the behavior of birds and insects. He knew which plants could be used as medicine and which ones were poisonous. He could move through the desert without leaving tracks that could be followed. And he could find water in places that looked completely dry. But more than his practical knowledge, Martha was drawn to his way of thinking about the world. When she complained about the harsh winter, he pointed out that the snow would provide water for the spring plants. When she worried about her empty grain stores, he showed her seeds and roots that could be gathered even in the coldest months. He seemed to see possibilities and solutions where she saw only problems. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing the last of her preserved fruit, Nalnish pointed to himself and then to her, and made a gesture with his hands that seemed to mean same. Martha looked puzzled, so he tried to explain with his limited English and more gestures. "You, alone," he said slowly. "Me alone." Then he pointed to both of them. "Now, not alone." Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. It was such a simple thing to say, but somehow it captured exactly what had happened between them. Two people from different worlds, thrown together by chance and desperation, had found something like friendship in the middle of their separate struggles. She nodded and repeated his words. "Not alone." That night, for the first time since Thomas died, Martha slept deeply and peacefully. Outside, the wind still howled across the empty landscape. But inside her cabin, she no longer felt like she was facing the world by herself. She had no idea that this Apache warrior would soon disappear from her life as suddenly as he had appeared, or that his promise to remember her kindness would lead to something beyond anything she could imagine. All she knew was that for now, in this moment, she had found something precious in the most unlikely place. She had found proof that kindness could exist between any two people, no matter how different their skin color or their way of life. And sometimes, Martha thought as she drifted off to sleep, that was enough to keep a person going through even the darkest times. The next morning, Martha woke to find Nalnish already up, sitting by the window and watching the sunrise. His color was better, and he moved with less pain than he had shown since she found him. She realized that soon he would be strong enough to leave, and the thought filled her with an unexpected sadness. But for now he was still there, still part of her daily routine of survival and small kindnesses. And Martha had learned something important during their time together. She was stronger than she had ever imagined, and she was capable of connecting with people in ways that crossed every boundary she had thought was impossible to bridge. By his second week in the cabin, Nalnish was strong enough to walk around, though he still moved carefully to avoid opening his healing wounds. Martha noticed that he spent a lot of time looking up at her leaking roof with a thoughtful expression, and sometimes he would run his hands along the walls as if he was studying how the cabin was built. One morning, Martha woke up to find him gone. Her heart jumped with panic. Had he left without saying goodbye? Had someone found him and taken him away? She grabbed her shawl and rushed outside, calling his name softly so as not to attract attention from any neighbors who might be passing by. She found him behind the cabin, gathering long strips of bark from the cottonwood trees that grew near her well. When he saw her worried face, he held up the bark and pointed to the roof, making gestures that clearly meant he wanted to fix the leaks. "You don't have to do that," Martha protested. But Nalnish had already started climbing onto the cabin with the careful movements of someone who had spent his life in the mountains and high places. For the next 3 hours, Martha watched in amazement as he worked on her roof. His people had been building homes in harsh climates for centuries, and he knew techniques that no white carpenter had ever taught her husband. He wove the bark strips together with small branches in a pattern that would shed water much better than Thomas's simple wooden shingles. When he finished, Martha's roof was stronger and more waterproof than it had been since the day they built the cabin. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Martha began finding small gifts left quietly around her property. A rabbit appeared on her doorstep, already cleaned and ready to cook. Wild onions and roots that she had never noticed before showed up in a neat pile by her kitchen window. A string of fish from the creek was hanging from her porch rail when she woke up one morning. Nalnish never said anything about these gifts, and Martha began to understand that this was his way of trying to repay her for saving his life. The food was more than welcome. Her stomach had been empty more often than full lately, but she was also touched by the thoughtfulness behind each offering. He was sharing knowledge that his people had developed over generations, showing her how to survive off the land when store-bought food ran out. One afternoon, he found her trying to repair a hole in her chicken coop, where a coyote had broken in and killed her last hen. Martha was struggling with the hammer and nails, and the board kept slipping out of place. Without a word, Nalnish took the tools from her hands and showed her a better way to make the repair. His movements were quick and sure, and Martha realized that he was not just a warrior but someone who understood how to build and fix things. "How did you learn all this?" she asked, gesturing at the neat repair he had made. He thought for a moment, searching for the English words. "Apache. Must know many things. Hunt, fight, build, fix," he tapped his chest. "Father teach me. Grandfather teach father." Martha nodded, understanding. Among his people, knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, just like it was supposed to be in white families. But Thomas had died too young to teach these skills to any sons, and Martha had been left to figure out everything by herself. As the days passed, Martha discovered that Nalnish had an almost supernatural ability to find things she needed. When her supply of lamp oil ran out, he disappeared for a morning and returned with a jar full of rendered fat from some animal he had caught. The fat burned cleanly and gave off a pleasant smell, much better than the smoky kerosene she had been using. When she mentioned that her garden hoe had broken and she couldn't afford to replace it, Nalnish spent an afternoon fashioning a new one from a piece of curved wood and a sharp stone. The tool worked better than the store-bought one Thomas had purchased years earlier. Most impressive of all was his knowledge of the desert itself. Martha had lived on this homestead for years, but Nalnish could see things in the landscape that she had never noticed. He showed her a hidden spring only a quarter-mile from her cabin that provided better water than her well. He found a grove of wild fruit trees that she had walked past dozens of times without realizing what they were. "The desert is not empty," he told her one evening as they shared a meal of rabbit stew and wild greens he had gathered. "White people see empty because they do not know how to look. Apaches see abundance." Martha was beginning to understand what he meant. Under his guidance, she started to see her harsh surroundings differently. What had seemed like barren wasteland began to reveal itself as a complex ecosystem full of resources for those who knew how to find them. But it wasn't just practical knowledge that Nalnish shared with her. He also taught her about patience and observation. When Martha was frustrated because her remaining chickens weren't laying eggs, Nalnish spent time watching the birds and pointed out that they were stressed by the smell of the coyote that had killed their companion. He showed her how to move the coop to a spot where the chickens felt safer, and within days they were laying again. When Martha complained about mice getting into her stored grain, Nalnish didn't suggest traps or poison like a white man would have. Instead, he found the holes where the mice were entering and showed her how to block them with a mixture of clay and thorns that would keep the rodents out, without harming them. Everything has purpose, he explained in his careful English. Mouse eat grain, but mouse also eat insects that hurt plants. Better to keep mouse away than kill mouse. Martha found herself fascinated by this way of thinking. Instead of fighting against nature, Nalnish seemed to understand how to work with it. His solutions to problems were often simpler and more effective than anything she had tried before. The most dramatic moment came on a cold evening near the end of his 3rd week with her. Martha was inside preparing a simple dinner when she heard voices outside. Through her window, she saw 3 rough-looking men approaching her cabin. She recognized them as drifters who sometimes passed through the area, the kind of men who took what they wanted and didn't worry much about who they hurt in the process. The biggest one, a man with a scraggly beard and mean eyes, knocked hard on her door. "Open up, lady. We know you're in there." Martha's hands shook as she reached for Thomas's rifle, but before she could grab it, the door swung open. She had forgotten to bar it after bringing in firewood. "Well, well," the bearded man said, looking around the cabin. "Living all alone out here, are you? That's not safe for a woman." His companions laughed in a way that made Martha's skin crawl. "I don't have anything you want," Martha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please just leave me alone." "Oh, but we think you do," the second man said. He was thin and weaselly, with darting eyes that took in every corner of the room. "We heard your husband died owing money. We figure you might have some valuables tucked away. I already told you." "I don't have anything," Martha repeated, backing toward the fireplace. "We'll be the judge of that," the bearded man said, stepping further into the cabin. "Boys, start looking around." That's when Nalnish appeared. Martha hadn't even seen him move. One moment the doorway behind the intruders was empty, and the next moment he was there, silent as a shadow. But there was nothing silent about what happened next. The Apache warrior moved with a speed and precision that took Martha's breath away. Before the 3 men even knew he was there, he had disarmed the biggest one and sent him sprawling across the cabin floor. The thin man tried to draw a knife, but Nalnish twisted his wrist in a way that made him drop the weapon and cry out in pain. The 3rd man tried to run, but found his way blocked by 6 feet of angry Apache warrior, who looked like he could break a man's neck without even breathing hard. "Leave," Nalnish said in a voice that was quiet but somehow more frightening than if he had been shouting. "Now!" The 3 men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the cabin like rabbits running from a wolf, and Martha heard their horses' hooves pounding away into the night. Nalnish calmly closed the door and barred it properly. Then he turned to Martha, who was standing by the fireplace with her mouth open. "You are safe now," he said simply. "How did you do that?" Martha whispered. "Where did you even come from?" Nalnish gestured toward the back of the cabin. "I hear voices. I come quick." He looked at her with concern. "Men like that? They come back?" Martha shook her head. "I don't think so. They're cowards at heart. They only pick on people they think can't fight back." That night, as they sat by the fire sharing the rabbit stew that had been interrupted by the unwelcome visitors, Martha looked at Nalnish with new eyes. She had known he was a warrior, but seeing him in action had shown her just what that meant. This wasn't just a man who could fight. This was someone who had been trained from childhood in skills that most people couldn't even imagine. "Your people," she said slowly. "They must be very proud of you." Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Some proud," he said finally. "Some angry. I think different about white people than others think." "What do you mean?" He struggled to find the English words to explain something complicated. "Many Apache say all white people bad. Kill all, take all land. But," he looked at her meaningfully, "you show me different. Maybe some white people, some Apache can live together, not fight always." The morning that would change everything started like any other. Martha was making coffee from grounds she had used 3 times already, trying to squeeze every bit of flavor from her dwindling supplies. Nalnish sat by the window, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and red. But something was different about him today. There was a tension in his shoulders, a look in his eyes that Martha had never seen before. "Someone comes," he said quietly, not moving from the window. Martha joined him and looked out at the empty landscape. She couldn't see anything unusual, but she had learned to trust his senses. Apache warriors could spot danger long before white folks even knew it was there. "Soldiers?" she asked, her heart starting to race. Nalnish shook his head. "Apache, 3 riders. They come to find me." Martha felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. After a month together, she had almost started to believe that maybe he could stay hidden forever. But of course that was foolish. His people would come looking for him eventually. "Are they friendly?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "I do not know," Nalnish said honestly. "Maybe they come to bring me home. Maybe they come to kill me for the things I said before I left." Over the next hour, Martha watched as 3 Apache riders approached her homestead. They rode with the easy confidence of men who feared nothing on this earth, and even from a distance she could see they were all warriors. When they were still 100 yards away, they stopped and one of them called out in the Apache language. Nalnish answered, his voice carrying easily across the desert air. The conversation that followed was in rapid Apache, full of gestures and tones that Martha couldn't understand but that sounded intense and serious. Finally, Nalnish turned to her. "They are messengers from my father. He is chief of our band and he is dying. He wants to see me before he goes to the spirit world." "Your father is a chief?" Martha whispered. "Yes, and when he dies the council will choose new chief. Some want me, some want my brother. That is why I was sent away, to keep peace while father still lived." Martha stared at him, finally understanding why he had seemed so different from the other Apache she had heard about. He wasn't just a warrior. He was the son of a chief, maybe even the next chief of his people. "You have to go," she said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "Yes," he said simply, "but first I must tell you who I really am." For the next few minutes, Nalnish explained his story in the best English he could manage. His father was the chief of a band of Chiricahua Apache, who had been fighting the white settlers for years. But Nalnish had spent time with government agents and military officers, and he had come to believe that the old ways of constant warfare would only lead to the destruction of his people. He had argued with the tribal council, saying that Apache and white people needed to find a way to live together, instead of killing each other. Some of the older warriors had called him a coward and a traitor. The arguments had grown so heated that his father had sent him away to prevent the band from splitting apart before the old chief died. "The soldiers who chased me," he continued, "they were not hunting me because I raided white settlements. They chased me because I was trying to meet with their leaders to talk about peace. But some white men do not want peace either. They make money from the fighting." Martha listened in amazement. She had been sheltering not just any Apache fugitive, but potentially the future leader of his people, a man who was risking everything to try to find a better path forward. "What will happen now?" she asked. "I must return. My father is dying and the people need to choose what kind of future we will have. If I am chosen as chief, I will try again to make peace. But it will be very hard. Many Apache have lost family to white soldiers. Many white people have lost family to Apache raids. There is much hate on both sides." The 3 Apache messengers were still waiting patiently outside, but Martha could tell that Nalnish's time had run out. Soon he would have to leave and she might never see him again. As if reading her thoughts, Nalnish reached into his shirt and pulled out a beautiful turquoise amulet on a leather cord. Martha had noticed it before but had never asked about it. The stone was a deep blue-green color, and it was carved with symbols that meant something important in Apache culture. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, placing it in her hands. "He was a great chief, a man of wisdom and courage. He taught me that true strength comes not from how many enemies you can kill, but from how many you can turn into friends." Martha looked down at the amulet, feeling its weight and warmth. "I can't take this. It belongs to your family." "You are my family now," Nalnish said quietly. "You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. You shared your food when you had nothing. You showed me that it is possible for Apache and white people to care for each other. This gives me hope that peace is not just a dream." Martha felt tears running down her cheeks. In the month that Nalnish had been with her, she had come to care for him in a way that she didn't fully understand. It wasn't the same as what she had felt for Thomas. That had been the love of a young woman for her husband. This was something different, something deeper. It was the bond between two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and had chosen to show kindness instead of fear. "You saved Nalnish," he said, speaking slowly and clearly in English. "Nalnish not forget Martha. Someday, if the spirits allow it, I will come back to repay this debt." "You don't owe me anything," Martha protested. "You've already given me so much. You fixed my roof, you brought me food, you protected me from those men. You showed me that I'm stronger than I thought I was." Nalnish smiled, and Martha realized she would miss that smile most of all. "You showed me something more important. You showed me that my grandfather was right about turning enemies into friends." He gathered his few possessions and walked toward the door. Martha followed him outside, where the 3 Apache messengers waited on their horses. When they saw Nalnish emerge, they nodded respectfully but didn't dismount. This was clearly a formal summons, not a social visit. One of the messengers had brought an extra horse for Nalnish. As he swung up into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, Martha saw him transform back into what he truly was. Not just the wounded fugitive she had nursed back to health, but a future leader of his people. Before he could ride away, Martha called out to him, "Nalnish, wait." He turned his horse back toward her and she ran to his side. "If you become chief, if you make peace between our peoples, will you be safe? Will there still be people who want to hurt you for believing in peace?" Nalnish looked down at her with an expression that was both sad and determined. "Martha, a leader who tries to change things is never completely safe. But some things are worth the risk. Peace is worth the risk. Will I ever see you again?" Martha asked, looking up at him. Nalnish looked down at her, and his eyes were full of a promise that he couldn't put into words. "If I become chief, if I can make peace between our peoples, then yes. I will come back, and I will show you the respect that you have earned. The Apache do not forget their debts, especially debts of honor." Martha reached up and touched his hand where it rested on the reins. "Be careful. The world needs people like you. And it needs people like you," he replied. "People who are brave enough to help a stranger, even when it's dangerous. People who can see past the color of skin to the heart underneath." With that, he touched his heels to his horse's flanks and rode away with the 3 messengers. Martha stood in her doorway watching until they disappeared behind the distant hills, 4 tiny figures against the vast sky. That evening, alone in her cabin for the first time in a month, Martha held the turquoise amulet and wondered if she would ever see Nalnish again. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had. Even in the dark days right after Thomas died, she had gotten used to having someone to talk to, someone who understood what it meant to face each day with courage even when the odds seemed impossible. She walked around the cabin, touching the things that Nalnish had repaired or improved. The roof that no longer leaked, the chicken coop that was now predator-proof, the new tools he had made for her, the basket he had woven from desert grass. Each item was a reminder of his time there, but also a gift that would help her survive whatever came next. As she prepared a simple dinner for one, Martha thought about everything Nalnish had told her about his life and his dreams. She tried to imagine what it would be like to carry the hopes of an entire people on your shoulders, to try to find a path between war and surrender, when everyone around you was demanding one extreme or the other. She didn't know that Nalnish would indeed become chief, or that he would spend the next 5 years fighting to create the peace he had dreamed of. She didn't know that he would think of her every day, remembering her kindness whenever the task of leadership seemed too hard to bear. And she certainly didn't know that he would return to fulfill his promise in a way that would shock the entire territory. All she knew was that for 1 month, her life had been touched by something extraordinary. She had sheltered an Apache fugitive and discovered that underneath all the fear and hatred between their peoples, there was still room for friendship, respect. 5 years passed like a slow, hard dream. Martha Caldwell woke up every morning in the same leaking cabin, but she was no longer the same woman who had sheltered a wounded Apache warrior in the winter of 1878. The desert had carved lines into her face and put steel into her spine. She had learned to survive in ways that her younger self never could have imagined. The first year after Nalnish left was the hardest. Without his help finding food and making repairs, Martha had to figure out everything on her own. She nearly starved during a particularly bad spring, when a late frost killed the vegetables she had managed to plant. But she remembered the wild plants he had shown her, the roots and berries that could keep a person alive when there was nothing else. She learned to set snares for rabbits the way he had taught her. and gradually she stopped waiting for someone else to save her. The creditors kept coming for a while, but Martha discovered something interesting about men who were used to bullying women. When a woman looked them straight in the eye and showed no fear, they often found easier targets elsewhere. She sold Thomas's tools and his good boots to pay off the biggest debts, and when the men in fancy suits realized there was nothing left to take, they moved on to bother someone else. Martha kept Nalnish's turquoise amulet hidden in a small wooden box under her bed, along with the few other precious things she owned. Sometimes, on the loneliest nights, she would take it out and hold it, remembering his promise to return if he ever could. But as the months turned into years, that promise seemed more like a beautiful dream than something that could actually happen. The newspapers were full of stories about the Apache Wars. Every few weeks there would be reports of raids on settlements, cavalry chases through the mountains, and peace talks that always seemed to fall apart. Martha read these stories with a knot in her stomach, wondering if Nalnish was involved in the fighting, or if he was even still alive. Sometimes the stories mentioned a Chiricahua chief who seemed different from the others, a leader who was trying to find ways to avoid bloodshed even while protecting his people's rights. The newspapers never mentioned him by name, but they described him as unusually clever and willing to negotiate with white officials when other Apache leaders refused to talk. Martha wondered if this mysterious chief might be Nalnish, but she had no way to know for sure. By her third year alone, Martha had become something of a curiosity among the scattered settlements of the territory. She was a woman who lived by herself on a remote homestead, and somehow managed not only to survive but to slowly improve her situation. She had learned to grow crops that could handle the harsh climate, to preserve food for the winter months, and to make money by selling eggs and vegetables to the few travelers who passed her way. The transformation hadn't been easy. That second winter had nearly broken her. The roof repairs that Nalnish had made held up well, but other parts of the cabin began to fall apart. A windstorm tore off part of her front porch, and she had to learn carpentry skills that Thomas had never taught her. Her hands got cut and calloused from handling tools she barely knew how to use, but gradually she figured out how to make the repairs herself. Food remained a constant worry. The wild plants and hunting techniques that Nalnish had shown her helped, but Martha had to expand her knowledge through trial and error. She made herself sick more than once by eating something that looked similar to the safe plants he had identified, but turned out to be mildly poisonous. She learned to test new foods carefully, eating just a tiny bit and waiting to see what happened. But gradually, Martha began to master her environment in ways she had never imagined possible. She learned to read weather patterns by watching the behavior of animals and birds, just as Nalnish had taught her. She discovered new sources of water during dry spells by following the paths that wild animals used. She even learned to make simple medicines from desert plants when she got sick and couldn't afford to see a doctor. Other women sometimes asked her how she managed it all by herself. Martha would just smile and say that you learned to do what you had to do. She never mentioned the Apache warrior, who had taught her so many of the skills that kept her alive. In the Arizona territory of the 1880s, admitting that you had helped an Apache fugitive was not something you talked about, even to friends. But late at night, when the desert wind howled around her cabin, Martha would remember those strange, precious weeks when she hadn't been alone. She remembered Nalnish showing her how to weave bark into waterproof patches for her roof, how to read the signs that told you where water could be found, how to move quietly through the desert without leaving tracks that predators could follow. More than that, she remembered having someone to talk to, someone who listened to her stories about Thomas and shared stories of his own people in return. The loneliness was the hardest part. Martha had gotten used to physical hardship, but she had never gotten used to having no one to share her thoughts with. Sometimes she would go weeks without seeing another human being. When travelers did stop by, they were usually men who looked at her with either pity or suspicion. A woman living alone was not natural in their minds. There had to be something wrong with her. During her 4th year alone, Martha had an encounter that reminded her just how vulnerable her situation really was. A group of young soldiers stopped at her homestead, claiming to be looking for Apache sign. Their leader, a lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, seemed to think that a woman living alone might be willing to provide them with more than just water and directions. "Must get mighty lonely out here, ma'am," the lieutenant said, letting his eyes wander over Martha's property and then back to her face in a way that made her skin crawl. A woman shouldn't have to face the dangers of this territory all by herself. Martha handled the situation the way Nalnish had taught her to handle the drifters who had tried to rob her, with calm confidence and no visible fear. She served them water and beans but kept Thomas's rifle within easy reach. And she made it clear that she was not interested in company. "I appreciate your concern, Lieutenant," Martha said in a voice that was polite but firm, "but I've been managing just fine on my own. Now, if you gentlemen don't mind, I have work to finish before dark." The soldiers left without causing trouble, but Martha spent the rest of that night sitting by her window with the rifle across her lap, remembering how safe she had felt when Nalnish was there to protect her. She realized that she had learned to project strength and confidence even when she felt scared, but it was a lonely kind of strength. It was around this time that the stories in the newspapers began to change. Instead of just reporting raids and battles, they started talking about a new kind of negotiation happening between the Apache leaders and the territorial government. There were mentions of a young chief who spoke excellent English and seemed to understand both Apache and white ways of thinking. This chief was apparently working to establish some kind of formal peace treaty that would allow his people to keep part of their ancestral lands in exchange for stopping the raids. Martha's heart jumped every time she read these stories. Could it be Nalnish? Had he become the leader he was meant to be? Was he actually managing to make his dream of peace come true? One particular newspaper article caught her attention. It described a meeting between territorial officials and this mysterious Apache chief, and it mentioned that the chief had surprised everyone by bringing gifts that showed deep understanding of white customs. The gifts included a beautiful wooden cross and a small American flag, both made with traditional Apache craftsmanship. Martha's breath caught in her throat when she read that detail. The wooden cross? Could it have been inspired by the simple cross that Thomas had carved, the one she had shown to Nalnish during his time in her cabin? Was this his way of letting her know that he remembered her, even as he negotiated for the future of his people? But even if it was him, Martha told herself, that didn't mean he would remember his promise to her. He was probably surrounded by important people now, dealing with big political questions that affected the future of his entire people. Why would he think about the widow who had nursed him back to health in a leaky cabin years ago? Still, she kept the turquoise amulet close, and sometimes she would catch herself scanning the horizon as if she expected to see riders approaching her homestead. It was a foolish hope, she knew. Even if Nalnish had become a great chief, even if he had managed to make peace between Apache and white people, what could he possibly want with a woman like her? By the beginning of 1883, Martha had created a life that was hard but stable. She had enough food stored for the winter. Her cabin was in better repair than it had been in years, and she even had a small amount of money saved from selling her extra vegetables. She was 34 years old, and she had learned to be content with her solitary existence. Her daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise. She woke before dawn, tended to her animals and garden, spent the hottest part of the day. The morning that changed everything started like any other summer day in the Arizona desert. Martha was up before dawn, as had become her habit over the 5 years of living alone. The early hours before the sun got too hot were the best time to get work done, and she had learned to make the most of every cool moment. She was drawing water from her well when she noticed something strange on the horizon. At first she thought it was just dust devils, those spinning columns of dirt that danced across the desert when the wind was right. But as she shaded her eyes and looked more carefully, Martha realized she was looking at something much more unusual. Dust clouds, big ones, and they were moving in a straight line toward her homestead. Martha's first thought was cavalry. Maybe there had been another Apache raid somewhere, and the soldiers were chasing raiders across the desert. She had seen this before. Lines of blue uniformed men on horseback following tracks that only they could read, determined to catch whoever had struck at white settlements. But as the dust clouds got closer, Martha began to see that these weren't soldiers. The riders were moving in a formation that was too organized, too ceremonial for a military pursuit. And there were too many of them, maybe 40 or 50 horses, all moving together like they were part of some kind of formal procession. Martha set down her water bucket and walked back toward her cabin, her heart starting to beat faster. In 5 years of living alone, she had never seen anything like this approaching her remote homestead. Whatever was coming toward her, it was big and it was important. and she had a feeling that her quiet life was about to be turned upside down. She grabbed Thomas's old spyglass from the shelf where she kept it and climbed up onto her roof to get a better view. What she saw through the magnifying lens made her hands shake so badly she almost dropped the spyglass. Apache warriors, dozens of them, riding in perfect formation across the desert, their horses moving at the steady pace of men who had traveled a long distance and knew exactly where they were going. They wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with pieces of white man's clothing, and many of them carried both traditional weapons and modern rifles. But this wasn't a war party. Martha had heard enough stories to know what Apache raiders looked like, and this was something completely different. These men rode with banners and ceremonial items. Their formation was too organized, too peaceful for an attack. This looked more like a delegation, and at the front of the procession, mounted on a magnificent black horse and wearing the regalia of a chief, was a man who made Martha's breath catch in her throat. Even after 5 years, even at a distance, she recognized him immediately. The way he sat on his horse, the set of his shoulders, the confident way he moved. This was Nalnish, but he was transformed from the wounded fugitive she had nursed back to health. This was a man who had become what he was always meant to be, a leader of his people. Martha climbed down from her roof on unsteady legs and stood in front of her cabin, watching the impossible sight approach her homestead. Her mind was racing with questions she couldn't answer. Why was he here? What did he want? And why had he brought what looked like half his tribe with him? As the procession got closer, Martha could see more details that amazed her. The warriors' horses were decorated with intricate beadwork and feathers. Some of the men carried staffs topped with eagle feathers and other symbols of authority. This wasn't just a group of Apache warriors. This was a formal delegation led by someone of great importance. When the procession was about 100 yards away, it stopped with military precision. Martha could see the warriors clearly now. Proud, dangerous-looking men who sat their horses like they had been born in the saddle. They were all watching her, but none of them seemed threatening. If anything, they looked respectful. The silence stretched across the desert as Martha and the Apache warriors regarded each other. She was just one woman standing in front of a small cabin, but she held her ground with the strength she had learned over 5 years of surviving alone. The warriors seemed to approve of this display of courage. Nalnish dismounted and walked toward her alone, leaving his horse with the others. As he got closer, Martha could see how much he had changed. He was older, of course, but it was more than that. He carried himself with the authority of someone who was used to making decisions that affected many people. His face had new lines around his eyes, and there were scars on his hands and arms that hadn't been there before. But his smile, when he smiled at her, it was exactly the same smile she remembered. He was wearing elaborate Apache regalia that marked him as a chief. A beautiful headdress with eagle feathers, a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and around his neck a turquoise amulet that was even more impressive than the one he had given her years ago. Everything about his appearance spoke of honor, authority, and success. "Hello, Martha," he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting. His English was much better now, smooth and confident. "I told you I would come back." Martha found that she couldn't speak. She had dreamed about this moment so many times over the past 5 years, but she had never really believed it would happen. Now that it was real, she didn't know what to say or do. The wounded Apache warrior she had sheltered had returned as a powerful chief, leading what appeared to be a formal procession across the desert to her humble homestead. Nalnish stopped about 10 feet away from her and spoke again, his voice gentle. "You are surprised to see me. Yes," Martha managed to get out. I hoped, but I never really believed." "I made you a promise," Nalnish said simply. "Apache keep their promises." Martha looked past him at the dozens of warriors waiting patiently in the desert. They sat motionless on their horses, showing the discipline and respect of men who understood the importance of this moment. Some of them were older warriors with gray in their hair. Others were younger men who looked at Martha with curiosity rather than hostility. "You brought an army with you," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nalnish followed her gaze and smiled. "Not an army, witnesses. What I have come to ask you is very important, and it must be done in the proper way." "Ask me." Martha's voice came out even quieter. Nalnish reached into his shirt and pulled out something that made Martha gasp. It was a turquoise amulet. identical to the one hidden in the wooden box under her bed, but even more elaborate. This one had silver work and small feathers attached to the leather cord, and the turquoise stone itself was larger and more perfectly shaped. "This was my father's," he said, holding it up so she could see it clearly. "He died 2 years ago, and the council chose me to be chief in his place. I have spent the last 5 years working to make peace between my people and the white settlers. We have signed treaties with the territorial government. We have our own land, and the fighting has stopped." Martha nodded, still not trusting herself to speak. The newspaper stories she had read over the years suddenly made sense. The mysterious Apache chief who had been working for peace, it really had been Nalnish. "But there is one more thing I must do to complete my father's vision of peace," Nalnish continued. "One more bridge I must build between our two worlds." He walked closer to Martha, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with gratitude 5 years ago, when she found him dying in the snow. "I have never forgotten what you did for me," he said. "You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. You shared your food when you had nothing. You showed me that Apache and white people could care for each other like family." Martha felt tears starting to run down her cheeks. After 5 years of wondering if he even remembered her, here he was, telling her that her kindness had shaped everything he had done since. "I have thought about you every day for 5 years, Nalnish said. "When the burden of leadership felt too heavy, I would remember your kindness and find strength to continue. When other chiefs said peace was impossible, I would remember the month we spent together and know they were wrong." He held out his father's amulet toward her, the turquoise catching the morning sunlight and throwing blue-green reflections across his face. "I have come to ask you to be my wife, Martha. Not just because of what you did for me, but because of who you are. You have survived alone in this harsh land for 5 years. You have shown courage and strength that would impress any Apache warrior. You are already the kind of woman who could be a chief's wife." Martha stared at him, her mind reeling. Of all the things she had imagined he might say when he returned, this was not one of them. She had dreamed of seeing him again, of knowing that he was safe and successful, but marriage? The idea was so overwhelming that she could barely process it. "Your people," she said weakly, gesturing toward the waiting warriors. "What do they think about this?" "They are here because they support it," Nalnish replied. "They have seen how the peace we made has benefited everyone. They understand that a marriage between Apache chief and white woman would be the final proof that our two peoples can live together." Martha looked at the impressive procession of warriors who had ridden hundreds of miles to witness this moment. These were men who had fought against white settlers. Martha spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about Nalnish's proposal. During the day, she could see the Apache camp by the creek, and she knew that dozens of people were waiting patiently for her answer. The weight of that responsibility was almost more than she could bear. On the first night, she sat up until dawn, making a list in her mind of all the reasons why she should say no. She was a white woman who had lived her entire life among white people. She knew nothing about Apache customs or traditions. She couldn't even speak the language properly. What did she know about being a chief's wife? About helping to lead a people who had every reason to distrust someone who looked like her? And what about the practical problems? Where would they live? How would other white settlers react when they learned that she had married an Apache chief? What about the territorial government officials who had signed peace treaties with Nalnish? Would they feel betrayed if he married a white woman? Would this somehow hurt the peace he had worked so hard to create? Martha paced her small cabin, holding the turquoise amulet he had given her years ago. She thought about her parents, long dead now, and what they would have said about their daughter marrying an Apache. She thought about Thomas and whether accepting this proposal would somehow be a betrayal of his memory. She thought about the comfortable, predictable life she had built for herself over the past 5 years, and whether she was ready to give all that up for something completely unknown. On the second night, Martha found herself thinking about all the reasons why she should say yes. For 5 years, she had lived alone on this homestead, surviving but not truly living. She had proven to herself that she was strong enough to make it on her own. But did that mean she had to spend the rest of her life by herself? More than that, she remembered the month she had spent with Nalnish, how right it had felt to have someone to share her daily struggles with. They had communicated across the barriers of language and culture to find something deeper, a connection between two people who understood what it meant to face the world with courage even when the odds seemed impossible. Martha walked out to her well and looked across the desert toward the Apache camp. She could see the glow of their fires and occasionally hear voices carried on the night wind. These people had traveled hundreds of miles to witness something they believed was important. They weren't here to force her into anything. They were here to support a decision that could change the relationship between two peoples forever. She thought about the newspaper stories she had read over the years, about the peace treaties that Nalnish had negotiated. If he really had managed to stop the cycle of raids and revenge that had been tearing the territory apart, then he was a man who could make his dreams into reality. And hadn't he told her that she had inspired those dreams in the first place? On the third night, Martha stopped thinking about practical problems and cultural differences and asked herself the only question that really mattered. Did she love him? The answer came to her as clearly as sunrise. Yes, she loved him. Not the desperate, clinging love she had felt as a young bride, but something deeper and more mature. She loved his strength and his gentleness. She loved his vision of a world where Apache and white people could live together in peace. She loved the way he had never forgotten her kindness, and the way he had traveled hundreds of miles to keep a promise he had made 5 years ago. And if she was honest with herself, she had never stopped loving him. For 5 years she had carried his memory with her through every lonely day and sleepless night. She had measured every other person she met against the standard he had set, and no one had ever come close. But love alone wasn't enough to make such a momentous decision. Martha spent that third night thinking about what it would really mean to become the wife of an Apache chief. She would be giving up everything familiar, her cabin, her routine, her place in white society. She would be entering a world where she didn't know the customs, couldn't speak the language fluently, and would have to prove herself worthy of respect every single day. Yet as she thought about these challenges, Martha realized they didn't frighten her as much as they should have. She had already proven she could adapt to difficult circumstances. She had learned to survive alone in the desert, to read weather patterns and find water, to defend herself against hostile men and dangerous animals. If she could do all that, maybe she could learn to be an Apache chief's wife too. On the fourth morning, Martha woke with her decision made. She dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, brushed her hair until it shone, and walked down to the creek where the Apache camp was set up. The warriors had been respectful during their stay, never approaching her cabin without permission and taking care not to disturb her daily routines. But she could feel their eyes on her as she approached, and she knew that this moment was as important to them as it was to her and Nalnish. She found him sitting beside the water, apparently lost in thought. When he saw her coming, he stood up but didn't say anything. He was letting her speak first, letting her control this moment. "I have questions," Martha said without any greeting. If she was going to do this, she needed to do it right. "Ask them," Nalnish replied, his voice gentle but serious. "If I marry you, where would we live? With your people?" "Yes, we have a village in the mountains, near the land that the government has given us. It is beautiful there with good water and places to grow crops. You would have your own home, but you would be part of the community." Martha nodded, picturing this mountain village she had never seen. "What would be expected of me?" "I don't know anything about being a chief's wife." Nalnish smiled, the same warm smile she remembered from 5 years ago. "You would learn, just like you learned to survive alone on your homestead. Apache women are strong and independent like you are. You would not lose yourself. You would become more than you are now." "What about children?" Martha asked, blushing slightly but needing to know. "If the spirits bless us with children, they would be raised to understand both worlds, Apache and white. They would be bridges between our peoples just like our marriage would be." Martha looked around at the camp, at the warriors who were trying to pretend they weren't listening to every word. "What do your people really think about this? Are they just being polite because you're their chief?" Nalnish called out something in Apache, and several of the older warriors approached. Martha recognized one of them as one of the messengers who had come to take Nalnish away 5 years earlier. "Tell her," Nalnish said in English. The older warrior looked at Martha with serious eyes and spoke in careful English. "You save our chief when he was hurt and alone. You share food when you have nothing. You show respect for Apache ways. We know you are good woman, strong woman. Chief needs strong woman to help him lead." Another warrior stepped forward, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gray streaking his black hair. "My wife, she lost her first husband in fighting with white soldiers. She very angry at all white people for long time. But when Chief tells story of white woman who save his life, my wife says maybe some white people have good hearts. You help heal the anger in our people. A third warrior, younger than the others but carrying himself with the confidence of a seasoned fighter, spoke up. I have children. I want them to grow up in a world where Apache and white people are not always fighting. Marriage between you and our chief, it shows my children that this is possible. Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. These men weren't just being polite. They genuinely believed that her marriage to Nalnish could help create the kind of future they wanted for their families. There is one more thing, Nalnish said quietly. If you marry me, you will face many challenges. Some white people will call you a traitor. Some Apache will always wonder if you can truly be one of us. It will not be an easy life. Martha looked at him for a long moment, thinking about everything he had said. Then she surprised him by laughing, not a bitter laugh, but one full of genuine amusement. Easy? She said. Nalnish, I have spent the last 5 years living alone in a leaking cabin, growing crops in desert soil, and fighting off anyone who thought a woman by herself was easy prey. I haven't had an easy day since my husband died. But you know what? I've learned that I'm strong enough to handle things that aren't easy. She reached into her dress and pulled out his grandfather's turquoise amulet, the one he had given her before he left. I've worn this every day for 5 years, not just because it reminded me of you, but because it reminded me that I had survived something difficult and become stronger because of it. Nalnish's eyes widened as he saw the amulet. You kept it. Of course I kept it. It was a gift from someone who mattered to me. Martha took a deep breath. And yes, I'll marry you. Not because it will be easy, but because it feels right. Because I love you. And because I believe in the same dream that you do. A world where people can look past the color of each other's skin and see the person underneath. The camp erupted in cheers and celebration. Warriors who had maintained dignified silence for 3 days suddenly broke into smiles and began calling out in Apache. Several of them fired rifles into the air, and someone started drumming on a traditional Apache drum that had been brought along for just this purpose. The news of Martha and Nalnish's marriage spread across the Arizona territory like wildfire. Within a week, newspapers as far away as San Francisco were running stories about the unprecedented union between Apache chief and white widow. Some of the headlines were respectful, calling it a bold step toward lasting peace. Others were sensational and cruel, using words like savage and betrayal that made Martha's cheeks burn with anger. But Martha had made her choice, and she refused to let newspaper gossip make her regret it. On her first morning as an Apache chief's wife, she woke up in a beautiful teepee in the mountains, surrounded by the sounds of a thriving community going about their daily business. Children were laughing and playing outside. Women were talking as they prepared the morning meal, and men were discussing the day's plans for hunting and gathering. The Apache village was nothing like what Martha had expected from the stories she had heard. Instead of a collection of crude shelters, she found herself in a well-organized community with comfortable homes, storage areas for food and supplies, and designated spaces for different activities. The village sat in a beautiful mountain valley with clear streams, good soil for growing crops, and plenty of game for hunting. It was overwhelming at first. Martha had lived alone for so long that being part of a large, close-knit community felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Everyone seemed to have a role to play, and she wasn't sure where she fit in. But Nalnish's aunt, a practical woman named Desba, took Martha under her wing and began teaching her Apache customs with patient kindness. You don't have to become Apache overnight, Desba told her in the careful English she had learned from trading with white merchants. But you must understand our ways if you want to help Nalnish lead our people. And you must understand that being Apache is not about the color of your skin. It is about the choices you make and the way you live your life. Over the next few months, Martha threw herself into learning everything she could about Apache culture. She learned to speak the language, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds at first but gradually becoming more confident. The children in the village became her best teachers, giggling at her mistakes but patiently correcting her pronunciation until she could make herself understood. She learned Apache cooking, discovering that many of the wild plants she had foraged during her lean years could be prepared in ways that were much more nutritious and delicious than anything she had managed on her own. The Apache women taught her to make acorn flour, to preserve meat for the winter months, and to prepare traditional medicines from desert plants. Most importantly, she learned about Apache values and traditions. She discovered that Apache society was more flexible than white society in many ways. Women had real power and influence, and they were expected to speak their minds on important matters. Children were raised by the entire community, not just their parents, and decisions that affected the whole group were made through long discussions where everyone had a chance to be heard. Martha also brought her own knowledge to the community. The survival skills she had learned during her 5 years alone on the homestead proved valuable in the mountains. She showed the Apache women new ways to preserve food and repair tools, and she helped establish a small school where Apache children could learn to read and write English without losing touch with their own language and customs. The most challenging part wasn't learning Apache ways, it was dealing with the reactions from the outside world. Government officials who had signed peace treaties with Nalnish were confused and sometimes hostile about his marriage to a white woman. Some saw it as a sign that he was becoming too influenced by white culture and might not be able to represent Apache interests effectively. Others worried that it would make him less trustworthy as a negotiator with white settlers. Even more difficult were the reactions from white communities. Martha's marriage had made her famous in ways she never wanted to be. Reporters sometimes showed up at the Apache village hoping to interview the white woman who married a savage chief. Most were turned away by Apache guards, but a few persistent ones managed to get close enough to shout questions that made Martha want to hide. Most white settlers treated her marriage as either a romantic fairy tale or a dangerous betrayal, depending on their own attitudes toward the Apache. Some newspapers wrote breathless stories about the love that conquered all barriers, while others condemned her as a traitor to her own race, who was helping the enemy infiltrate white society. But gradually, something interesting began to happen. The peace that Nalnish had negotiated between his people and the territorial government began to hold in ways that previous peace agreements never had. Raids and counter-raids became rare events instead of weekly occurrences. Trade between Apache communities and white settlements increased, bringing prosperity to both sides. Children from both cultures began to grow up with less fear and hatred than their parents had known. Martha's marriage became a symbol of this new kind of peace. When white settlers had disputes with Apache communities, they often asked Martha to help mediate because she understood both sides and could speak both languages fluently. When Apache young people wanted to learn white customs without abandoning their own heritage, Martha helped bridge that gap too. She found herself becoming something she had never expected to be: a diplomat. White officials who were nervous about meeting with Apache leaders felt more comfortable when Martha was present, to help translate not just words, but cultural meanings. Apache families who were suspicious of white intentions trusted her to explain when white people were being sincere versus when they were trying to cheat or manipulate. The most wonderful surprise came in their second year of marriage, when Martha discovered she was pregnant. The news sent waves of excitement through both the Apache village and the surrounding white settlements. This child would be living proof that the two cultures could truly come together and create something new and beautiful. When their son was born, a healthy, beautiful baby with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, Martha felt like her heart might burst with love and hope. They named him Thomas Nalnish, honoring both Martha's first husband and his Apache heritage. From the moment he drew his first breath, little Thomas was surrounded by people from two different worlds who were determined to give him the best of both. The Apache women taught Martha traditional ways of caring for babies, showing her how to make a cradle board that would keep Thomas safe while allowing him to see the world around him. The white settlers who had become friends of the family brought gifts of cloth and tools that would help the child as he grew. Thomas became a symbol of hope for everyone who believed that peace between the cultures was possible. As Thomas grew from baby to toddler, Martha watched him switch effortlessly between English and Apache, between white customs and traditional ceremonies. He was equally comfortable playing with Apache children and talking to white visitors who came to the village. He was becoming exactly what Nalnish had dreamed of, a bridge between two worlds. By their 5th year of marriage, Martha and Nalnish had 3 children: Thomas, a daughter named Hope, and another son called David. Each child grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both Apache and white society. They learned to hunt and gather in the traditional Apache way, but they also learned to read and write in English. They participated in Apache ceremonies but also understood Christian traditions. More importantly, they grew up in a world where cooperation between cultures was normal instead of unusual. For them, it wasn't strange to have Apache and white friends, or to speak two languages, or to celebrate holidays from both traditions. They were the future that Martha and Nalnish had dreamed of, children who saw differences between people as interesting rather than threatening. The success of their marriage began to inspire others. Several other Apache men married white women who had proven themselves worthy of respect through acts of kindness or courage. A few white men married into Apache families, learning Apache ways and becoming valued members of the community. Each of these marriages strengthened the bonds between the two communities and made peace more lasting and real. Martha never forgot her roots or pretended to be something she wasn't. She remained proud of her white heritage while embracing her new Apache identity. She kept the wooden cross that Thomas had carved, and she made sure her children understood the stories of both their grandparents. But she also learned to see the world through Apache eyes, to understand the deep connection between people and land that was at the heart of Apache spirituality. As the years passed, Martha often thought about that snowy night when she had found Nalnish collapsed by her well. If someone had told her then that she would end up as the wife of an Apache chief, the mother of bicultural children, and a respected leader in her own right, she would have thought they were crazy. But life had a way of surprising you. Sometimes the most important decisions you made were the ones that seemed impossible at the time. Martha had risked everything to save the life of a stranger, and that act of kindness had grown into something beautiful beyond anything she could have imagined.